This week, we're going to take something of a mess up or a screw up in terms of the gluing aspect of things and try to rectify it in the form of some deflex to make this bow a little more manageable, a little sweeter to shoot, and a little more efficient as it turns out. Hang out with me and we're going to turn this into a nice reflex deflex bow. All right, so nothing more has happened with this particular bow blank than just having been removed from the mold. So we are rough edges all through here. Need to remove the tape on the belly side that was there to protect it from the epoxy, and kind of get it trimmed down to its, blank form. I am going to put a quick measure on it here to give you a flavor of what we're dealing with in terms of deflex. And we are talking a full 3 1/4 inches. And I know that in some instances, bowyers would be salivating over a 3 1/4 inch reflex on a bow blank to get started with, because that gives you all kinds of room to take set and still retain some reflex. In this particular instance, guys, it's important to understand, and I learned this over a period of time, that extreme curves like this, guys, they are not all they're cracked up to be, right? That when you have to move your limb tip so far to get it even strung, right, just to even get to brace height, and the potential for twist, right, for crystals, for any sort of malady to occur in these limbs, the price is just too high. Because as it turns out, no matter how much preload you have in these limbs, when it's strung, you're still pulling zero. Right? Deflexing this puts an element of safety into the bow itself. So when we talk about efficiency and safety and trade-offs with regard to bow efficiency, the fact that a bow is deflexed is not a negative thing. It's net reflex is what we're after, and we don't need a ton of net reflex for a bow to be efficient. It all comes down to the load on those limbs, and the important distinction here is the load on the working limb. Okay, the amount of limb travel this takes to come to string height is not working. That is non-working limb. Everything that goes into bracing a bow is wasted beyond its draw length. All right, so we are not going to waste what energy we have in these limbs. What we are going to do is put a deflex into this bow, and we are then going to preserve what energy storage we have built into these limbs when we get to a full draw scenario. Okay, so that's the magic of a deflexed and reflexed bow. Got everything all cleaned up, smoothed out, squared up as best as I could, and have determined a bottom limb and a top limb, and I have no evidence to determine which one is which outside of what feels like is more easier to bend on a floor tiller. So that's all I've got working for me at this point. And based on what I believe to be the least amount of resistance, have designated this particular limb as the top limb. And that is going to be very important as we move forward from here, as far as it is concerned with regard to how we're going to put our deflex into the grip of this bow. So here's our top limb, and we'll move forward with the deflex from here. All right, I got some layout done here on the grip. This is the geographical center line of the bow. And what I've done is measured up 1.5 inches and then 4 inches down from there, which would be 2.5 inches to the lower side here to get my 4-inch grip. This has been predicated, if you can see, put my middle finger on that middle line, and that gives me my fulcrum. The bow balances on my middle finger at that point, which works out perfect for an arrow rest. All right, so that is kind of what has prompted this particular layout. Now, this particular mark right here is the center of the grip itself. And the way that we're going to put the deflex into this bow is to make it a takedown. Any of my deflex bows would be deflexed right at the center of the riser. Not the center of the grip, but the center of the riser. And since this is the center of the bow, this is the center of the riser, essentially, or center of my grip, rather. We're going to put our cut right in here. Now, I'm going a little aggressive to the underside, because what I'm going to do is then come back here at about like this angle here, and we're going to close this gap. And closing the gap here will deflex the bow, and it will actually deflex it right at the geographical center of the bow. There, and you can see that, the reflection, because it's hard to see the pencil on Ipe, but there you go. That is going to be the work that we do to get this bow deflexed. Took that cutout, just like I had talked about, and if I put it together like this, and I am lining up my tips to the front of the workbench here, we now have, it's between 1.25 to 1.5 inches of deflex. All right, so nothing too significant. This is a very clean shape right here. We're going to take full advantage of the reflex in these limbs without having to put so much load on them before we get them to brace height. And that's really the efficiency of this particular style of bow, is that you get that very high, like early tension, but it's not so much stress on the limbs themselves. Did a little refinement work here. You can see that this is how this is going to go together, just like so. This here's my top limb, so that's where it's going to be stationary in terms of the sleeve, and then this is going to be my removable tenon right here. You can see that I have put a lot of effort into getting this very smooth, and I can feel tactily that it is getting narrower as it approaches this tip in all directions. And that's the most important thing in the sleeve, is that it's narrower as it approaches the insertion tip right here, so that it will slide back out of that sleeve. The upper side has been left real rough and misshapen, as a matter of fact, to just kind of help the purchase of that fiberglass and epoxy wrap, so it stays put on there and allows this lower sleeve to pull off without any problem, and that it will stick on that top side. So I put on some tape here to kind of protect the surfaces. I will prepare this tenon. I'll melt some wax in there. I have sanded it to a finish. So I've sanded it to 220 grit. I'll put some beeswax on there as a finish, and then put a release agent on there before I do the wrap. And that way, this portion is basically done. It'll be all done when the wrap is complete. We'll continue the build from there, but we won't do anything to adjust or finish or do any adjustments to the tenon here for not fear of, but the consequence of changing how well it fits into that sleeve. So when the sleeve is applied in this scenario, your tenon should be 100% finished. Okay, there's to be no more alterations to this tenon once we put the sleeve in. You can see the limbs clamped into the jig here for wrapping on our fiberglass handle wrap. And you can see the lower, our tenon piece is coated in petroleum jelly right here. So Vaseline. Right, to ensure that we get a good release on there. Everything's lined up, ready to go. So now all we got to do is get our epoxy wrap going. I have mixed my epoxy according to manufacturer's instructions here, and I am now applying the 1-inch wide fiberglass strips. I have 8 strips at about 36 inches long, and applying each one in succession over the previous. Keeping it pretty generous with the epoxy so that I can get a really firm hold here. But this is really nothing exciting about this. It's really pretty tedious work, but it gets the job done. All right, guys, we are wrapped up and ready to go. 8 wraps of fiberglass tape along with some epoxy and black aniline dye just to give it that finished appearance in the finish when we go about sanding everything out. But as it stands right now, we got to let this guy cure. So, guys, thanks for hanging out in the shop with me this week. We'll break this thing apart next week and then finish off the build. It may take another episode or 2 to get there, but guys, for the time being, I appreciate your attention, and I will see you next week.